Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Publics at IIHS. This is a series where we invite scholars and practitioners to come and talk about their work. And we are very excited to have Rahul Mukherjee here with us today. Thank you, Rahul, for joining us. I know it is very early in the morning there. Rahul is here to talk from his latest book, Radiant Infrastructures, Media, Environment, and Cultures of Uncertainty. And Rahul, we are really excited to hear more from you. We're also joined by Vikas John. Vikas is Senior Manager Research at IIHS and will be moderating today's session. So before we begin, I'd like to let everybody know if you have questions or comments, just drop them in the chat box or Q&A and we'll take them towards the end of the session. So over to you, Vikas. I'll ask you to introduce our speaker and then start the session.
All right. Thanks so much, Tanvi. And thanks folks for joining in this evening in Bangalore. I'm not sure what time it is from where we are logging in. This is one of our part of the ongoing Publics at IIHS series, and we're very fortunate here today to be joined by Professor Rahul Mukherjee. He is the Dick Wolf Associate Professor of Television and New Media Studies, as well as Associate Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania. His interests and scholarly work are wide-ranging, spanning conceptual lenses of mobile telephony, Bollywood thrillers, development discourses, and translocal documentaries. He's a widely published scholar, and today he'll be, like Tanvi mentioned, speaking from his most recent work. It's published by Duke University Press, and it looks at mediations of debates and controversies related to radiation emitting technologies and the creation of what he's terming environmental publics. And I'll hand over to Rahul in a sec just to reiterate what Tanvi said. We will have about 15-20 minutes at the end of the conversation of Q&A, so please do get in your questions in the chat box, or sorry, the Q&A box. And so Rahul, thanks for being here, and all yours.
Thanks, Vikas, and thanks to IIHS Public Series for the invitation. And I'm very happy to speak about my book. It's kind of an excerpt from the book, which will mostly deal with kind of my chapters on the cell antenna signals and the controversy around them in India, but the book also, as you mentioned, has this kind of comparative angle with some of the debates around the construction of nuclear reactors as well. So I'll move to my presentation and talk through some vignettes, at times reading, but also maybe talking through the slides as and when. Just quickly share my screen. So perhaps I will begin with an anecdote or a vignette here from the time I was in Mumbai last time in June of 2017, as a way of suggesting that I would really like to be back in India for some time now amidst the pandemic, but that's not happened yet, hopefully soon. So in June of 2017, I had taken a taxi from the airport and was on my way to Kolaba in South Mumbai through the Bandra-Worli Sea Link. On my left was the Mumbai skyline and also cell antennas that were ensuring smooth connectivity for my taxi driver's phone conversation. He was talking in Bhojpuri with a relative of his in the city of Benares. The whole stretch of the bridge had cell antennas lined up on the left at periodic intervals. On my right, interspersed between, just checking if the, on my right, interspersed between street lights on the bridge's median strip were boards advertising cellular operator Reliance Jio's 4G data services on mobile phones. These boards continued their prominence on the median strip until the Marine Drive beach. The city of Mumbai seemed like a cellular city with cell antennas, cell phones, and cell phone service advertisements very much a part of its streetscape and skyline. Though not visible, cell antenna signals enveloping the city's cluttered atmosphere were making their way through unplanned congeries of things and people. Bouncing off buildings and permeating crowds, these signals were connecting millions of cell phones. 7 years earlier, first reports of potentially carcinogenic cell tower radiation appeared in Mumbai's daily newspaper, Midday. Cell antenna signals were causing a concern for some Mumbai residents who found their apartment balconies in the woody way of antenna beams. Lots of mediation in various formats, debating cell antenna signals. Rajasthan Patrika launched a campaign, Bhatti Mein Shahar, City Inside the Furnace. NDTV's talk show, We the People, deliberated on invisible signal. And CNN IBN's, CNN News 18's lifestyle show, Living It Up, had situated testimonies where affected community members presented anecdotal evidence, a kind of evidence which, as I'll talk more, led to quite a bit of controversy around expertise. By mid-2012, India's telecom regulatory authorities had passed so-called stringent laws restricting antenna emission levels and ordered evictions of cell antennas that flouted city construction rules. So based on the kind of ICNIRP guidelines, the Department of Telecom and the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India had these regulations. They reduced the threshold level to sort of 0.45 watt per meter square. But then some affected community members suggested that there were cancer cases close to towers where the power density was 0.001 watt per meter square. So a lot of debates around what the threshold level of cell antenna signals to be allowed. In early 2014, cellular operators were citing the removal of cell towers by the government and regulatory authorities and anti-radiation activists as the reason behind the recurrent call drops experienced by India's mobile service customers. Spectrum allocation also was the reason. It often is the reason as well. With the entry of Reliance Jio in 2015, there was certainly a spurt in infrastructural investments as other telecom players like Airtel were also constructing cell towers on a massive scale in order to provide affordable data packages to the rising number of smartphone users. As I saw cell antennas on my left and Jio's boards on my right, I found myself tracing the recent history of ongoing change in the country's wireless industry and environment. By the time I reached Kolaba, that day it was raining, marking the beginning of monsoon showers. What I have briefly recounted is indeed a history packed with many twists and turns. My approach to studying these signal troubles in India's cities from 2010 to 2017 is to track the interactions between different stakeholders of the cell antenna radiation controversy and the call drops controversy as part of an emerging and continuously reconfiguring environmental public. I'm going to be talking a lot about publics today in this kind of public series. It's not meant to be that tautological, but it happens to be. So as Stephen Graham has argued, it is often only when infrastructures fail or cause disruption that people take notice of them. Before the health effects of cell towers became news in India, if people were ever reminded of their presence, it was when they faced difficulty in conversing on the phone. That is, in the case of a disruption in the telecom service and in cellular mobility. The problem was attributed to the distance of the tower or its location out of sight, or the obstruction of the signal by buildings. To sustain the signal and the architecture of mobility, more cell towers were established. Yet when cell towers were associated with cancer or sleeplessness, they became disruptive for the Indian public in a different way. So you have Rabani Garg here, first in the talk show, We the People, hosted by Barkha Dutt, talking about the first time she kind of noticed cell towers as a way to locate perhaps what was the reason behind her daughter's cancer. So she says, and I'm just reading it, when it all started, when she got diagnosed, I was too traumatized, all of us were, and I blamed it on many things. I thought maybe I did something. You go through the motions, this happened, that happened. And one day while sitting in my husband's office, I looked out of the window, a giant tower. And I don't know, like when you started the show, you mentioned, we don't even notice, it's true. But this idea of how kind of one notices cell towers, which are all out there, quite ubiquitous across cities, but one notices it as a potential cause of something, and what that moment looks like and how infrastructures can turn disruptive. So through their disruptive nature, in this case, their impact on environment and public health, cell towers call into action environmental publics. Such publics consist of a variety of stakeholders, including radio frequency scientists, cellular operators, journalists, tower builders, municipal corporations, building owners, should add oncologists. These stakeholders are affected by the radiation issue and are compelled to act to address it. Studying environmental publics does not merely entail knowing each stakeholder's perspective or opinion, but analyzing how they interact, debate with one another on the issues that affect them. from September to December 2012, and then again in February and June 2017. I conducted fieldwork in the 3 cities of Jaipur, Mumbai, and New Delhi. This work included interviews with stakeholders affected by the radiation issue and visits to densely cluttered cell antenna sites, media houses, and public meetings organized by apartment residents to debate the impact of cell tower signals. The fieldwork helped me to comprehend how different stakeholders use or interact with the media to influence public opinion about environmental issues like the cell tower radiation scare. Environmental publics are never bounded, they're always in formation. In what follows, I track this always emerging public composed of varied stakeholders and their interactions through the course of an environmental controversy. This environmental public is both constituted by media events and objects and also influenced by them. Tracing the public entails tracing the relations between such events and objects. The concept of intermediality with its stress on examining such relations will be an essential critical framework as I track the shifting configurations of the public. Tracking the mediations of cell antennas also includes attending to dynamic intermedial relations set up among non-human actors of the ontologically heterogeneous environmental public, which include radiation detectors, microwave ovens, aluminium foil, cell phones, and cell antennas. These diverse technologies have become part of the knowledge system that makes radiation visible and palpable in popular public demonstrations. So what I'm suggesting that through intermediality, I'm not only looking possibly at how different, like how the cell tower radiation issue sort of moved across different shows across, say, We the People, from NDTV to CNN IBN's Living It Up, or from a local newspaper like Rajasthan Patrika to NDTV, or when I'm thinking about environmental publics, and of course thinking about some of these stakeholders that you see here, Faye D'Souza's Mirror Now show, where different stakeholders are, affected community members, a representative from the Cellular Operators Association of India, a doctor, a lawyer, a journalist discussing a kind of court case around cell towers, but also thinking about radiation detectors, the relationship between some of these stakeholders with radiation detectors, with aluminum foils, microwave ovens, which were used as a way to make the cell tower radiation palpable and visible in different registers. So this is sort of a trailer of things I've planned to discuss today. I'll go through them in stages. To begin, in part 1, I'll first discuss how in my book I've found a clear separation, but also a comparative register to discuss different radiant infrastructures, as Vikas was mentioning. I also discuss nuclear reactors, so one nuclear towers and another cell towers. Controversies around nuclear reactors were somewhat restricted to rural India, while the cell antenna debates only seem to happen in cities and some towns. Then in part 2, I shall move to discuss the hyperlocal nature of cell tower controversies, and also sort of the debates around how to make a sense of invisible cell antenna signals. In part 3, I shall examine particular radiation sensing practices activated by concerned citizens that rearranged intermedial relations between the different sensing technologies. And in part 4, I'll try to speculate a bit about the various aspects of infrastructural imaginaries crucial to thinking about wirelessness and urban futures, including 5G and smart cities. So that's the plan. So this is the book Vikas mentioned, Tanvi has mentioned as well. I was trying to work through this concept of radiant infrastructures, and particularly the idea of radiant or radiance in radiant infrastructures. So there is this kind of double-edged sword around radiance, which I was kind of trying to theorize, as well as think empirically through the infrastructures I was studying. The radiance or radiant and radiant infrastructures connotes the luster of hope about a nation's economic growth attached with such infrastructures, such as nuclear reactors, bringing electric energy and illumination, and cell towers, promising kind of ubiquitous communication, kind of digitalized India. At this, so you can see them in these ads by different cellular companies, as well as, say, the Nuclear Power Corporation of India Limited's ad about brightening millions of lives. So this particular ad about how the electricity brings water to fields in the NPCIL ad. At the same time, radiance also suggests or stands in for harmful and often imperceptible radiations and signals with possible health effects. Mediation accentuates both aspects of radiance. The mediated radiance of radiant infrastructures as glistening objects of a nation's development is contaminated by the mediated uncertainties about the material effects of impalpable radiations on human bodies and citizens' well-being. While conceptualizing the infraness of radiant infrastructures, scholars simply cannot confine themselves to studying the visibility and or invisibility of cell towers. They must account for the invisible radiations and the uncertainties they create. My friend Nicole Staroselsky, while thinking of her project on solar energy in relation to my book, put it beautifully. Media work to reorganize radiant life, to redistribute life as it is entangled in a field of spectral exchange. There is here a sense of both the light, but also the specter, the spectral, and also the electromagnetic spectrum. Cell antenna signals don't just carry information. These signals are lightning-like pulses, intensively drifting across electromagnetic frequencies. These electromagnetic waves were detected as part of highly publicized discoveries and inventions involving wireless telegraphy in the late 19th century. In the Victorian period, before wireless, science and capitalism bracketed and labeled the space through which these signals traveled as the electromagnetic spectrum. The waves were intuited as radiant energies vibrating in the luminiferous ether. So I'm thinking through some of these kind of ether-associated concepts in Victorian period through the work of Bruce Clark and Linda Henderson. During the 1920s, cafes in Vienna advertised free radio using the image of a lightning bolt. This ideogram evoked the speed and power of electricity, as well as the visual translation of the sparks, which were sort of the spark plug transmitters in radio, emitted from early radio devices or wireless transmitters. I'm thinking through this because the mobile phone, in a way, is a kind of two-way radio transmitter and receiver, and that history of radio kind of very crucial to the history of the mobile phone. So, although both reactors and towers emit invisible radiation and play an important role in India's development, they're rarely discussed in tandem. There are, however, some key differences between cell towers and nuclear reactors. For one, they emit different kinds of radiation, ionizing in the case of nuclear and non-ionizing in the case of cell antennas. And one could argue that technical specificity matters. Another difference of great consequence is that their locations and affected communities vary vastly. Nuclear reactors are being constructed in rural areas, displacing fishermen and farming communities. Cell towers remain an urban problem, with mostly middle class and upper middle class populations organizing campaigns to evict towers from their neighborhoods. The state, policymakers, and media organizations view rural fishermen and the urban middle class very differently. In my book, I wanted to juxtapose two examples of the mediations of these controversies to reveal just how divided the social fabric of India is. I've met documentary filmmakers shooting in rural India and also journalists working on lifestyle shows about urban health problems. The committed documentary filmmakers make an argument against nuclear reactors, while the lifestyle shows take up the plight of urban middle-class urban residents who do not want cell antennas in their backyards. R.P. Amudan, whose quote I've just placed here, who made a trilogy of documentaries on nuclear energy programs in India called Radiation Stories, told me that his films are poor people's mela or fair or festival. And upper middle class elites with political connections have no place in his documentaries. Shows like CNN IBN's Living It Up are about privileged lifestyles. There's even a suggestion somewhere that talking relentlessly on the phone is an urban addiction, just like eating potato chips. Documentary filmmakers interested in bringing social change do not feel inspired to make films regarding the cell tower radiation and the anxieties of the privileged class, and lifestyle shows assume that rural fishermen have only livelihoods, not lifestyles. So the mediations of reactors and towers are imbricated with the political economy, public perception, and government policy regarding these radiant infrastructures. And this is the kind of comparative register within which I was working. So not only this idea that these publics that form around nuclear reactors and cell towers are different because the radiations are different, ionizing and non-ionizing, but also the locations of where the controversies unfolded were different, rural, urban, and those differences were stark, but also the kind of organizing that helped or that aided in constituting those kinds of publics of affected stakeholders was also very different. Just to give another quick example, some of these pictures of protests on the beach, and on the sort of the lights are from the reactor in Kudankulam, pictures taken by Amartrad Stephens. Also the example of the National Alliance of People's Movements, NAPM, which mentions Japan se kya sikha, lessons from Japan, these kinds of solidarities that are across anti-nuclear movements. The NAPM has taken, of course, causes of the sort of urban poor, but also, say, the Narmada Bachao Andolan. And there seemed to be a kind of synergy and solidarity across some of the anti-dam and anti-nuclear movements, also affected members of the Bhopal gas tragedy, also had that solidarity with these movements. The cell tower controversy also tried to build a solidarity with the Bhopal gas tragedy, as thinking of a kind of city incident, but that didn't quite happen. I mean, it was just a different movement in a different register. There were some cases of discussing cell antennas amidst the urban poor, but they were very limited, and most of the cases were in sort of more plush areas of the city. One example in Dharavi that the Helka discussed mentioned how, while in most cases cell antennas were found on rooftops, and the controversies was around the rooftops, they found a cell tower within somebody's house itself in Dharavi. So while I was studying the cell tower radiation issue in the early decade of the 2000s, the role of resident welfare associations was growing, and the elite urbanites as urban citizens were claiming a particular idea of the city for themselves. These elite urban notions were marked by specific ideas of cleanliness and pollution, and which, as Gautam Bhan has noted, created a public discourse on urban development that was based on inequality, impoverishment, and exclusion, powered by judicial activism. The geographer D. Asher Gettner has explained how the early 2000s witnessed a drastic increase in public interest litigations, PILs, by resident welfare associations. So some of the cases where the resident forums would discuss the kind of distance and whether the distance between a cell antenna and a building or a window of a building was safe enough or not safe enough, had that kind of juridical characteristic to them. Amita Bhaviskar's work comes into mind about bourgeois environmentalism here as well. And then there were some of the linkages between this idea of evicting cell antennas, similar to evicting hawkers on their kind of close to their homes or on the streets, that are discussed in some of these resident forums and blogs as well. At the same time, cell antennas, as much as they were considered a threat to the environment, they were also considered in the kind of green zone or a green infrastructure, just like malls, in a kind of paradoxical way, as Asher Gettner also talks about it. While the environmentalism of the anti-cell antenna campaign was certainly tinged by not in my backyardism, NIMBYism, and bourgeois environmentalism, it needs to be noted that some of the arguments made by elite urbanites about flouting of regulations by cell tower companies was indeed accurate. Cell towers were built in large numbers in several places, which flagrantly violated the regulatory standards set up by DOT and TRI and city municipal corporations. One of the sites I visited in the Cuff Parade Road area in Mumbai, you can see a lot of cell antennas very densely cluttered together in the rooftop of a commercial lodge. Hotel Supreme next to a residential apartment. Hotel Supreme is only 3 floors tall, but the apartments that surround it have more than 20 floors. The antennas are angled upward, which makes residents of the posh apartments very worried about their safety. The residents of the neighboring apartments had moved a petition to the Mumbai High Court, and after the ruling, there were delays in the implementation, but finally a number of antennas were removed in March 2017. That said, a number of them have been put back in place again. The other picture is of, so many of these debates would happen around in residential areas, but there were some of these public places like the Haji Ali Juice Center, which also became a sort of topic of discussion frequented by a lot of people, and therefore kind of conspicuous in that sense of people noticing a kind of densely clustered set of antennas. During the controversy, the discussion about mobile towers shifted from the removal to the strength of the signals that the antennas housed in the towers were allowed to transmit. As I mentioned before, cellular operators maintained that they were following the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, ICNIRP guidelines, which set the permissible limit of cell tower signals at 4.5 watts per meter square. As a matter of abundant precaution, the Indian Department of Telecommunications, DOT and TRI, following the suggestions of an interministerial committee, reduced the allowable EMF emission levels to 1/10 of the prevailing ICNIRP norms, that is 0.45 watts per meter square. However, dissident scientists and anti-radiation activists spotlighted cancer cases close to towers where the measured EMF was as low as 0.001 watt per meter square, suggesting that individuals respond differently to EMFs. They mentioned that children and elderly are the most vulnerable, and therefore there cannot be a blanket threshold for every section of the society. There were different sort of controversies around measurements. Some suggested that the beams were being measured at different distances from one another. Others suggested that that one measurement company, when it came to measure, was measuring at a different point of time, and then the antenna direction had been changed, and therefore the signal level mentioned at the spot was found to be different. As you can sort of see, very different readings coming up based on different times that different measurement agencies were measuring these. So these contestations sort of continued. Different experts in the cell tower radiation debate assume different threshold values of radiation to be safe. This is often the case in radiation controversies that involve nuclear radiation as well. The threshold level prescribed in many environmental debates reference acute exposure to toxicity and radiation without taking into account that radiation in small but regular doses could cause slow mutations in human bodies and have enduring effects. Although cell towers became a target of attack, it was actually the antennas in those towers that posed the threat. Even more specifically, it was the sector antennas that were deemed harmful and not the dish antennas, which were involved in benign point-to-point communication. Common people were able to get some sense of the threat that had been troubling them through radiation meters and EMF detectors, but the dependency on experts persisted. The various detectors were made by different experts, and if these experts did not concur about the minimum permissible value of radiation, how could their manufactured devices be expected to adhere to a common standard? How a number of other variables, such as the height of buildings or the signal path and the direction of antennas, play a role, making it difficult to give a universally applicable value for a safe distance from the tower. So this became a kind of question and sort of finding out what could be done. There's also this debate about how some of the dissident scientists or counter experts were making their own commercial sort of commercializing their radiation detectors, and therefore there was an argument about science and capitalism sort of working against one another and a kind of conflict of interest. Others mentioned different kind of standards while determining their thresholds, and was a spar between experts themselves. So I'll play this clip where beeping radiation detectors became a way for urban citizens to demonstrate in front of television cameras in their homes particular radiation zones. And I'm hoping that you are able to hear this.
The towers came up in 2005, and we were all quite unaware of what they were at that time. We thought they were just TV towers or something of that sort. Suddenly our back started going, our bones started paining, the servants started getting problems.
The family got hold of a radiation meter, and that provided some clues. The yellow light on the meter was a clear signal that the radiation levels were very high in their home.
This is the room where my daughter was living during her pregnancy, and the baby born had a tumor in the eye. We didn't realize the cause of it till we came with this machine and we realized the radiation level is so high that it's red. Now, of course, we've asked them to move out of here, but it's a problem. Look at the level of the radiation in here. It's so high that
On the urban lifestyle health show Living It Up, Preeti Kapoor walks through her bedroom with the radiation detector beeping and its LED lights flashing red. The diegetic sounds produced from the measurement device become part of the soundtrack as Kapoor narrates the story of how her pregnant daughter, who used to sleep in the room, gave birth to a baby with an eye tumor. The sounds and lights from the measurement device act as audiovisual evidence of the pervasiveness of cell tower radiation in the room, and a correlation is drawn between tumors and radiation. While these oral and visual perceptual affordances of the device certainly increased its popularity among the general public, many specialist experts cried foul, claiming that this was a move away from scientific precision. The general public, including frightened residents, affected patients, anti-radiation activists, and inquisitive journalists, started navigating cities with radiation detectors, marking those places where the detector beeped red near a cluster of cell antennas. In this process, they generated maps of affected regions. Um, so the other example was of Carmel Nair, again, a kind of cell tower outside the window of her house, as she's framed in the way, and she mentions about sort of living under the X-ray shot 24/7. And one could sort of argue that X-rays are part of ionizing radiation, that the radio frequency, electromagnetic fields, RF EMFs emitted by cell antennas are non-ionizing, so they can't quite cause genetic mutations, that they only have thermal effects. But this question about whether non-ionizing radiation can lead to any genetic mutations remains a discussion that experts continue to not have a consensus on. Um, so perhaps the equivalence drawn here seems scientifically problematic, but at the same time, what Nair talks about in terms of a kind of chronic exposure to a kind of everyday chronic exposure to RF EMFs seems like an important discussion to have. Through her testimony, through Nair's testimony, the banality of the fear psychosis becomes apparent. It is not about a sudden pang of fear that erupts with the first recognition of the cell antenna's effects and leaves the body forever. Instead, there are these small eruptions for Nair every single day. Nair's worry leads to premonitions about the future of her unborn child. She's mentioned she's pregnant. And this idea about how what the lifestyle show does is kind of allows for a situated testimony. So not kind of in a television studio discussing or deliberating on invisible signals, but actually at the particular location where one sort of first noticed the tower became an important thing to discuss. And this idea of staging situated testimonies rendered a different kind of valence to anecdotal evidence. And there's been a lot of writing in science and technology studies about this. And what I've tried to sort of bring out is kind of the different media formats of these shows and how anecdotal evidence discussed in, the more sort of science and technology studies literature could be sort of put together. So here I'm trying to sort of think through conversations between urban studies, science studies, and media studies together. Talk about a few instances and you would sort of see similar staging and framings of a certain kind of unwanted proximity or intimacy with cell antennas and concerned citizens here as well. So several images of concerned citizens in Jaipur appear as part of Rajasthan Patrika's coverage of the radiation story. This is the Patrika office in Kesargarh, Jaipur. Several citizens several images of concerned citizens in Jaipur appeared as part of Patrika's coverage of the radiation story. These citizens who were affected patients or relatives of sick people appeared in the foreground, either wielding measurement devices or pointing an accusatory finger at the set of mobile towers in the background. Such photographs almost give the impression that people like to see themselves in the newspapers. In the pictures, the tower was always nearby, just across the street or on the terrace of the adjoining house, looming, an ominous shadow set to engulf the city. Consider this example. This is the particular example of Mani Ramji, who's shown standing on the terrace of his bungalow. He's holding the signal measurement instrument with LEDs on his right hand, and his index finger is pointing to the red light, conveying that radiation levels are dangerous. He's framed against the backdrop of the tower that is responsible for harmful radiation, or that he thinks is responsible for harmful radiation. It is a self-consciously staged image. Another image in the same article shows a couple wielding The radiation detectors as 3 towers loom behind them. This one, I know it's a small image here. Patrika journalists went to many neighborhoods in Jaipur responding to complaint letters from their readers and were able to portray the individual experiences of the residents. Such a door-to-door, or rather rooftop-to-rooftop campaign highlighted the situated knowledges, here I'm citing Donna Haraway, of the locals suffering from the deleterious effects of nearby towers. Some of these stories mention how a family member in a particular room was more affected because that room intersected with the main beam of the cell antenna. Thus, Patrika's hyper-localized campaign emphasized that people have knowledge of their living situation and of their body, and that they feel the bodily sensations resonating with antenna frequencies. Such portrayals encouraged other Jaipur denizens to tell their stories and allowed some of them to stop worrying about the stigma of being recognized as a cancer patient. Being in the papers and telling their stories was akin to taking part in a community initiative. More stories meant more anecdotal evidence, but it remained uncertain whether this would lead to raising the epistemic status of anecdotal evidence to that of scientific evidence. As I've said, like anecdotal evidence is a highly contested terrain, even amongst scholars from humanities to social sciences to the sciences. And Patrika's reported, sort of like when I discussed it with their editors, they said that they couldn't wait for science, which seemed uncertain at that time, to not talk about their community members. And so they wanted to talk about it. This was some of the maps they generated along with some scientists working in different colleges in Jaipur. So there is no one central, all-capturing or all-conquering medium capable of covering the entire environmental controversy around radiant infrastructures. Rather, media are dispersed across many forms, genres, and practices, and has been talking about it, documentary films, talk shows, digital maps of radiation hotspots. And in trying to sort of put them in relation, I thought that intermediality would allow for a capacious notion of media by enabling the mixing of different formats, platforms, and technologies, and interlinking different media's discursive, materialist, sensory, and phenomenological dimensions. And I'm sort of inspired from some of the work done by Lisa Parks in a different context, where she thinks much more widely about the term coverage or media coverage. So in 2013, July, I was at a meeting, the building on Warden Road, where there was this deliberation happening where the people in this particular apartment or flat had been told by a neighboring flat association that cell antennas atop their terrace and roof were causing problems in that other apartment building. And so here both the cell tower builders had come along to present their case, as well as sort of anti-cell tower radiation activists had also come to present their case. The officials, the cell tower builder officials wanted to retain their towers in these apartment buildings and did not want the residents to be persuaded by the anti-cell tower radiation campaign folks. So one of the sort of concerned citizens or activists switched the microwave oven on and stood in front of it with the radiometer. The LED lights of the radiation detector glowed red, and as soon as this person, whom I'll call M, moved away from the microwave oven, the detector lights shifted to green. This person mentioned at that time that ladies should stand in front of the should not stand in front of the microwave oven, thinking in a way bringing this kind of correlation between microwave ovens and the microwaves emitted by the microwave oven with the kind of EMFs emitted by cell antennas and cell phones. So here the detectors translate across different modes of perception. The similar heating effects of microwaves and cell tower signals can be perceived by bringing radiation detectors close to microwave ovens. People begin to comprehend that microwave ovens might have properties similar to those of cell towers when they become part of a medial configuration using radiation detectors. In order to understand how media works and how people use it, it is important to attend to such intermedial relations where, quote, intermediality is a concept that brings forth relations that cannot be defined in media as fixed forms. I'm thinking through Katerina Krytlova's work here. The concept of intermediality helps to ascertain the ways in which technological objects of media are related both to one another and to human actors. If we consider the intermedial relays in M's experiment across cell antennas, mobile phones, microwave ovens, and radiation detectors, we emerge with a media assemblage for measuring radiant energies. Instead of a techno-deterministic or media-centric approach that highlights the efficacy of radiation detectors and sensors, I'm more interested in interpreting M's experiment as an exercise in so-called lay citizen participation, where human capacities to apprehend radiation emerge through actual encounters with sensing technologies. Here, media becomes a complex assemblage, or still better, a practice in the making, where particular radiation monitoring technologies and environmental concerns, as well as bodies and politics, quote, concretize into specific occasions that can galvanize citizen sensing. And this is from a lot of work on citizen sensing that Jennifer Gabriz has done both in the UK and the United States. In stressing media relations, intermediality becomes a useful concept to foreground how media is part of socio-materially situated practices of radiation detection and citizen participation. What sort of continues here, and this way of experimenting is not uncommon across a lot of sort of anti-cell tower or anti-cell antenna, anyone who's like concerned around sort of the cell phone radiations has over time have demonstrated using microwave ovens, have also used aluminium foils. So one of the other things that this person M does in this particular meeting is he wraps up the cell phone in aluminium foil and then asks somebody to call the cell phone, and the cell phone is not reachable. And he also suggests that having this aluminum foil not only blocks the cell antenna signals, but also kind of reflects them back. He says, again, and adds a caveat that this is not scientifically proven, but that this has not been scientifically not proven either. So there remains this kind of uncertainty that is being utilized here for action. And I mean, there is a lot of debate about whether microwaves and aluminum foil should actually be used in these kinds of experiments. And many believe that that shouldn't be the case. But having used them, I was interested in the kind of discourse that was being sort of set up here. So though there is no conclusive evidence that aluminum can completely block all kinds of non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation, a number of demonstrations by citizens worldwide, some of which are on YouTube, have exhibited how mobile phones wrapped in aluminum foil lose their connectivity. And in aluminum foil shields and even silver sort of coated shields have been used also in popular fiction like Better Call Saul. And I'll have some examples like that in a particular electrosensitive like Chuck McGill. I'll come to that. The other promised action of reflecting back the EMF signals is not that easy to demonstrate, but again, has its backers. Certainly, M's statement could make his audiences more nervous than usual. Prior to attending this rooftop meeting, they had been evaluating the ethics and morals of benefiting financially from a technology that is potentially harmful to their neighbors in the path of the sector antenna beams. Now they were learning that their own lives could be threatened from the same radiation if the residents of the adjoining apartments started installing aluminum shields in their respective houses. The EMF signals emitted from cell antennas would then be reflected back on the residents of the host buildings affected. So media here are not fixed objects, but part of medial events and processes dynamically constituted within emerging systems. Abdulmalik Simo writes that infrastructure concerns itself with the in-between, the things that lie in between humans that are able to both draw humans together and at other times make them withdraw from one another. Infrastructures thus exert not only a material force, but also a socializing force that is closely connected to their materiality. The telecom infrastructure would undergo a change with the addition of aluminum shields to its assemblage. The residents of apartments hosting cell towers who had presumed themselves immune from the dangers of radiation find themselves having to rethink the situation. The effect of aluminum shields is not certain, but then neither is the effect of non-ionizing EMF emissions. Munshi, through his has shared some information that he himself qualifies as indeterminate, but which has generated new ripples of uncertainty about the future of cell towers. Simo's remarks on infrastructures are both pithy and evocative here. And I quote, "People work on things to work on each other as these things work on them," unquote. It is through the implicit hint of the possibility of aluminum shield deployment that M stands a chance of influencing flat residents to consider dismantling the antennas. Like the radiation detector and microwave oven, the aluminum foil is a technology that becomes part of the extended media ecology of cell towers. Simmer's influential idea of people as infrastructure focuses on the body and the labor of practitioners. And Brian Larkin and Shati Chattopadhyay have written about this. So this influential idea of people as infrastructure focuses on the body and labor of practitioners so as to distance oneself from the spatial language of urban planning that is sometimes caught in the dominant discourse and perception of the built space. In this case, I'm suggesting that while thinking of radiation sensing practices, there's a way of relocating emphasis to body as media and media as infrastructure. Furthermore, it seems that media as radiation sensing, blocking, and potentially deflecting technology, reflecting technology, I'm thinking here of the aluminium foil and the aluminium window shield, can add dynamic layers to the built spaces. While thinking of the body as media, I'm not just thinking of the human body. So a wealthy dweller in Jaipur lost one of his family members to cancer and was anxious to get towers around his house removed. He did not completely trust the telecom officials when they said they have reduced the signal levels emitted by a cell antenna next to his house. He would monitor the signal levels using a radiation detector, but remained unsure. It was when peacocks returned to his garden that he felt reassured that the signal levels were indeed low. More than the word of telecom operators, more than the efficacy of EMF detectors, he believed in the peacock's sensitivity to wireless signals. He relied more on the peacock's perception of radiation than on the readings of the radiation detector. If the peacocks did not feel the radiation signals to be oppressive, they must be below the norm, and he could finally relax. A peacock's body here mediates the infrastructure of cell towers. At the molecular level, impulses in the peacock's body interact and interfere with the electromagnetic signals of the towers. This is how I found people coping with uncertainties in their lives. This anecdote, one among many that people living close to cell towers shared with me, suggests that in situations of uncertainty, perceptions of technology are articulated using vernacular mythologies of the everyday. In this story, we sense the merging of discourses, affects, and practices as relationships between human bodies and animal bodies continue to emerge. Here, mediation takes an interspecies turn, maybe thinking through, again, Donna Haraway's work, a turn that has a cultural dimension as well. So again, I mean, this kind of anecdotal evidence, again, would be highly disputed by experts. But this is how I saw people coping with the uncertainty. I mean, one can talk about the more recent examples of how people are coping with the uncertainty around the COVID pandemic, and we'll talk more about that perhaps in the Q&A. Just a few examples of some of the other controversies around smart meters and how electrosmog meters are being used. Some case studies in Northern California, a TED talk by Jeremy Johnson, an electrosensitive, and you sort of see here this idea of another kind of detector here using sound as they approach. There's a particular framing of some of these videos around measurements. There's been a lot of discussion around how electrosensitives who are sensitive to EMFs have found a place of refuge in Green Bank, West Virginia, where it's a kind of radio-free zone because there are radio telescopes which are extremely sensitive to such frequencies. Moved there to stay. Mentioned about this particular example of Chuck McGill when he emerges from his house in this show Better Call Saul. He sort of wraps himself up in this kind of silver coat. So I've been sort of discussing that there are these everyday encounters of citizens in this kind of the infrastructural imaginary around cell antennas, like having tea in one's home and then suddenly seeing new towers being put just next to your house. So there is this kind of everydayness alongside this kind of disruptive aspect, which is certainly a part of the infrastructural imaginary of cell antennas. And this is where we've been talking about mostly citizens. But I also want to say that infrastructural imaginaries are co-produced by states and citizens and lie at the intersection of structured policy, corporate initiatives, and lived experiences, affective encounters of ordinary citizens. And I think I've talked quite a bit about the affective encounters of ordinary citizens, but I want to talk a little bit about the state and how thinking through some of the ideas around neoliberal cities as kind of radiant cities. Cell antennas are very much part of the state corporate agenda for neoliberal governmentality. However, the invisibility of cell antenna signals and the uncertainty about their environmental footprints in the environmental landscape of radiant cities also perturbs neoliberal governmentality. touting its, I mean, in the sense, there is a sense in which everything needs to be made legible and visible in neoliberal governmentality. And Ravi Sundaram writes about that in a kind of media urbanism context of how piracy or informal sort of media kind of perturb or puncture some of that ways of thinking about digitality and neoliberal governmentality. And I'm thinking that the invisibility of cell antennas, even as cell antennas are very much a kind of state corporate sort of investment in a kind of technological modernity, the invisibility, the impalpability of some of these signals also perturb some of those aspects. The state wants to get back the neoliberal governmentality models want to kind of make that legible as an exercise of transparency as well. So one thinks of Tarang Sanchar, like wave transmission as a rough translation, was literally designed to communicate information about waves amidst this controversy, right? They wanted to make legible and make regulatory authorities look good as the fact that they were doing something to address the concerns of citizens here. So Tarang Sanchar is communicating information about these EMFs, which are indeed waves or signals. Tarang Sanchar was launched on May 2nd, 2017, and offered an easy to use map-based feature for viewing mobile towers in the vicinity of localities in India, and to ensure that cell antenna sites across the country were compliant with the DOT TRI guidelines. The e-portal is designed to offer a map of cell antenna sites with ground-based, wall-mounted, and rooftop sites differentiated by color. After clicking on an antenna site, a pop-up opens that indicates the different cellular operators whose antennas are located there, what technology they're using, 2G, 3G, 4G, and whether the site is EMF compliant. The citizens want to know the signal strengths of particular antenna sites in their localities. They must enter additional information on the Tarang Sanchar application, and thereafter are sent an email with the details. If citizens require a particular location checked for signal strengths, they can make a request through the portal for a nominal fees of 4,000 rupees. I don't know if the amount has changed or some of the aspects have changed, but I'm talking about it from when I was doing the field work in sort of the mid 2000s, soon after the site was developed in May 2017. So according to government ministers and regulators, it was designed to ensure compliance rather than environmental safety, because in their view, there were no environmental effects from cell tower radiation. Digitalization of governance materialized in this forum. So there remained questions amongst concerned citizens whether the kind of readings that DOT and Tarang Sanchar were providing, could they provide continuous data, or was it just a particular data at a particular time? So they asked questions like, do the DOT and Tarang Sanchar have the capability to monitor cell antenna signals that could account for peak emissions? Was there a particular time when the cellular traffic was significant? Can the DOT provide data for 30 continuous days of a month so that one can determine the peak hours? In other words, do signal levels fluctuate throughout the day in a specific pattern? Are there spikes in signal levels depending on cellular traffic density? Some of the things that could be emailed across. Along with the controversy over cell tower radiation discussed earlier in this chapter, there also arose heated debates about an increase in dropped calls. This issue, if allowed to escalate, could lead to serious concerns regarding the credibility of telecom operators. In June 2016, Airtel began the Open Network Initiative, which made available tower and signal visualization data regarding its network coverage and signal strengths. This information is accessible via a platform app on both laptops and mobile phones. Airtel as a service provider expressed the desire to share data with Indian consumers about where its network was strong, where it was weak, and thus needed work. Through this crowdsourcing, crowd mapping initiative, Airtel wanted those who were already its customers and others who were potential customers to provide the company with feedback and reviews about signal connectivity, network availability, and voice call quality in their respective local communities. Airtel also designed candid advertisement campaigns with punchlines as "Hum aapse kuch nahi chupayenge," we will not hide anything from you, and "Kyunki sahi galat samne aane se hi banta hai sabse best network," because only when right and wrong are foregrounded can we become the best network. The Bangalore-based Center for Internet and Society has argued that the Open Network website contains merely the visualization of data, but not actual data. The app has no provisions for customers to access raw data through application program interfaces. Furthermore, even though the platform color codes individual towers to indicate their signal strength, it remains unclear how the categories no coverage, moderate, good, excellent are arrived at, and the date timestamp when each signal level was obtained is not indicated. Customers are able to provide only minimum feedback. They can call a help center or submit an online form through the app, but they cannot insert signal levels or cell tower data directly onto the maps. But it is also true that the open network has made cell antennas partially visible. This limited infrastructural visibility helped Airtel collect and make visible the diffuse incidents of call drops to an audience that became part of the continuously reconfiguring environmental public. And as a scholar of infrastructures, I was quite fascinated that in some of these ads where people have sort of moved from their basement to the parking because the basement doesn't get connectivity, and then move to the watchman's cave at the parking level where they are able to get a connection, and that becomes a kind of impromptu conference room. And finally, they call this number use the open network aspect of Airtel, and the maintenance officials come with the cell tower. But there was a kind of foregrounding of the cell tower in these ads, which I had not seen for some time. So that seemed to me to be striking, and in a way, again, an idea where there was a certain kind of transparency being promised about emission levels, even though complete transparency is not quite possible, and there remains a certain kind of opacity. Overall, cell antennas remain ambivalent infrastructures of urban development. Some urban denizens view it as a symbol of development, as a necessary infrastructure to end digital divide and inaugurate smart cities. Others remain apprehensive about the possible harmful health effects of cell antenna radiation. Even scientists and other experts remain divided and uncertain about the long-term health effects of cell antennas. Thus, a particular culture of uncertainty remains about this media infrastructure and the urban imaginaries it constitutes, and is in turn constituted by. I'm close to finishing here. Delivering wireless services and maintaining public health are both crucial, and therefore it is not surprising that wireless service providers and affected communities often end up battling one another over the introduction of 5G, fifth generation wireless technologies, which are all the rage now. Cellular service providers tout 5G as the next generation tech that will cut latency periods, provide seamless streaming as never before, and make augmented reality and the Internet of Things more fun and part of everyday smart lives. Some suggest caution, noting that 5G could spark global trade and security disputes, and public health scholars remain skeptical about whether the radio frequencies emitted by 5G antennas, some of which are moving from microwaves to millimeter waves, others quite perhaps remain in microwave, are indeed safe. By the 1890s, there was a growing resistance to the aesthetics of the widespread wired infrastructure in places like New York City, with utility poles being removed from high traffic areas. The clutter of electric telegraph and telephone cables created a strain on the pole, which if it collapsed could then threaten people who could be hit by the disorderly wires carrying energy and signals. With contemporary wireless communications, wires may have lessened, but some objects like the cell antenna still remained, which become aesthetic eyesores at times. So early 20th century, the kind of wireless had its kind of moment in the sense of like getting rid of at least some wires, and now a kind of different where people are asking for evictions of cell antennas. So this image of a cell antenna in New York City at the intersection of East 8th Street and 5th Avenue, Manhattan, with its brick-like fascia, is one example of the different ways cell antennas are concealed or made inconspicuous. That said, paying attention to the wavy and fluid radiant energies rather than solid radiant infrastructures makes us notice the intervening medium of the air, as Jennifer Gabrice calls it. The concept of intermediality is something that emphasizes the inter as the in-betweenness of media gets further buttressed as we think of the atmosphere between solid media objects and infrastructures as a medium as well, to think of the fact that some signals travel through wires, but some signals are just traveling through the air. In Adrian Mackenzie's use of the term wirelessness, could be the experience of inhabiting a post-network world where one is connected to a number of wireless objects and infrastructures, but not sure how exactly does that connection work and where the devices are. Mackenzie is interested in the experience of wirelessness, often an ephemeral and barely registered feeling. The discourse on 5G antennas, some of which are based on millimeter waves and smart cities, intensifies and complicates the experience of wirelessness in radiant cities. It is important to note, though, that smart cities and cloud computing are not just based on wireless technologies, but very much rely on wired infrastructures. It is important to be able to imagine the socio-technical relations across a variety of media infrastructures, cell antennas, data centers, spectrum, and optical fiber cables, which together support the distribution of audiovisual traffic across vast distances. And this is the one which was recently a data center opened outside, sort of beyond Navi Mumbai in Panvel by the Hiranandani Group and Associates, a big data center there. So each of these media infrastructures are marked by emissions and exposures, by transparencies and opacities, and by visibilities and invisibilities. I'll end here. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks so much, Rahul, for that absolutely fascinating work, and thanks for sharing it with us. So what we'll do now is just take a few minutes for Q&A. Just a reminder to folks, if you have questions, please do type it in the Q&A box. I know there were a couple that already came in. Rahul, if you want to take a gander at this.
Yeah, so maybe I can see a question by Chaitanya today.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll read out Chaitanya's question, which is essentially, do we have a solution to cell antenna locations without disrupting the common man's life? And is it possible in a country like India, taking a population density into consideration? And if so, would private companies, governments taking over this issue be more helpful? So in a sense, partly what you were already speaking about, Rahul, in terms of government and the roles and the alliances that form between government and corporate sectors.
Yeah, yeah, it's difficult to sort of generalize it in the sense that it's so specific, but some of the things that Chaitanya has identified are quite accurate in the sense of the problem, which is that one of the aspects mentioned is that India has a high population density, and most people, I guess, again, cannot quite sort of generalize it, but many people have phones as well. And so there is both a kind of, with the population density in particular cities, there's also the kind of density of cellular traffic. And so there has been a case made that there has to be a way in which one should sort of feel normalized about these cell antennas. But I think, I mean, so the idea is that, you know, we should get maybe more and more prepared with this idea of, particularly with 5G antennas, which are much more smaller than the usual antennas, but they are more numerous in terms of how the technology works, because they allow for a faster sort of movement of signals. At the same time, they have to sort of, because of the wavelength frequency aspects, they have to be more closer together than earlier antennas. So there has been a discourse about sort of normalizing them, sort of thinking of them as I mentioned, perhaps in another talk I gave at during the Urban Imaginaries Conference, of sort of a kind of analogy being made with water reservoirs, or you know, the kind of water tank in one's rooftop, and then also a 5G antenna maybe. And there remain questions about, of course, moving across, whether more research needs to be done. And there has been more research now, at least comparatively, with 2G and 3G vis-a-vis, say, 5G, which is a more new technology. Some suggest that, you know, it's already being researched and this is just fear mongering. So in a way, as a more sort of a humanities scholar, my focus was in trying to think about both kind of internal contradictions in both, you know, how the state corporate camp kind of talks about this. There are internal contradictions there are problems there, but at the same time, there are problems also in the way, you know, microwave ovens and aluminum foils and peacocks are brought together in this kind of way by concerned citizens. So internal contradictions problems remain within both these kinds of groups, which are, you know, which are kind of the affected stakeholders trying to find a way of making sense. but I was interested in how they kind of were utilizing different ways of working through this. So that has remained my sort of core concern for studying. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Ram. So, I mean, while we wait for questions to come in, I just wanted to sneak one in over here, particularly on the idea of the form that different media assemblages, when you talk about them and how they come together, and the ways in which the form is sort of brought to bear in, to speak about issues. And I want to, I mean, you in your presentation used the photography of Amritraj Stephen and Amadun's work, documentary work, as well as, I'm forgetting the filmmaker, but Buddha Weeps in Jadugar.
Yeah, Sri Prakash.
Sri Prakash. And there's a comparison to the film Half-Life in Fukushima. And so I just wanted to sort of, sort of delve a little over here and sort of think about them as individuals and sort of co-producers of discourse, and to sort of think through how in your conversations, how they imagine what they speak of and speak through, right? Because there's a very, very interesting way in which I think you bring out the ways in which the framing happens in Buddha Weeps and Jaduguda, as well as in Amritar's photography. So just to sort of maybe spend a few minutes on that and sort of your thoughts about how form comes into being, particularly of people within those assemblages and within those publics.
Yeah. So I mean, thanks for the question, because I mean, as perhaps is quite so. There are kind of stark contrasts, certainly in the way the documentarians vis-a-vis, say, the lifestyle TV folks, and the way they want to discuss this issue, and the way they are going about framing this, or the kind of perceptions they have about which struggles to pick up, and which they can. I mean, perhaps lifestyle TV shows. I mean, they might want to think about some of these issues, but their mandate is for picking up how urban lifestyles lead to public health problems or are connected to them. So that's their kind of mandate. Here, it's more about how livelihoods like fishing are being affected by nuclear reactors or uranium mining or monazite mining or mining of rare earth metals in Maniwala Kuruchi, which is one of the places where Amudan is thinking about his interview subjects. So, but at the same time, and of course, it's coming from a very different movement, right? The anti-nuclear movement, which one could go back to the Narmada Bachao Andolan, which is a different kind of committed filmmakers, a particular movement, which is much different from the kind of discourses or rhetoric that was going around kind of the idea of concerned citizens. And what happened in Mumbai when I met with some of them is that they didn't even like the activist label. They said, we are not activists, but concerned citizens. So there is, of course, a filmmaking tradition, which is different, which is again associated with particular kinds of social movements and not other kinds of movements. So yeah, so there is that. But at the same time, there are interesting similarities too. For example, the lifestyle show, also allows for a certain kind of on-location shooting. It allows for that kind of situated testimony, which is also there in Amudan's documentaries, or even in Stephen's framing, which is that at times the nuclear reactor kind of is in the back. Because it's still at a quite some considerable distance because of differences in radiation. But Amudan also frames a woman and tending to a goat, and then the nuclear reactors in the sort of background. So there is this implication that if the nuclear reactor is getting built, that this woman and her goat are going to be displaced, which is a different. But there is a kind of that relation similar to this kind of situated testimony in some of these lifestyle shows, around like having them framing them next to the cell antenna in the from the window of their house or next to that antenna outside. So I was interested in both those kinds of continuities and differences.
So yeah, and so I think, I mean, it's also striking to me to think about those, like exactly like you're saying, the histories and the trajectories of evolution of those kind of forms, right? I mean, they tend to speak to certain type of, I wouldn't not speak for a certain type of citizenry in that sense, right? So it's interesting to see that the urban middle class aligns itself in the language of the lifestyle shows of television. There's an immediacy of evidence in that, like it's journalistic in that sense, right? So that was very interesting to me to sort of think through that dichotomy. And one could think about why the documentary space or the history of the reactor or Ramadan's work doesn't have the same kind of presence in television, in media, right? So I don't know how the market assembles itself, how those assemblages and how those things come together to sort of exclude some, include some, and make visible voices, strategically in some senses.
Yeah, I mean, one could talk in length about, like, as you mentioned, like, who is this being made for? One is quite clear about who are being framed as subjects of this documentary, who are being interviewed. And the other question remains, like, who is watching these documentaries? Um, I mean, the venues moved from, college students to affected community members in another place. Um, so there have been cases where they've taken some of these films across different areas that are affected by nuclear tests or by uranium mining. So from, some slides from Jadugoda to close to, say, the Rawat Bhata nuclear reactor, or to Ketolai, where the nuclear tests happen in Rajasthan, or to Maniwala Kuruchi, or showing, films related to the Fukushima nuclear spill in Tirunelveli, in sort of southern Tamil Nadu. So there are those kinds of spaces which make for these kinds of somewhat singular screening venues, which lead to a lot of discussion. But at the same time, you're absolutely right that they're not often given the space on TV. I mean, there's a long discussion about how some of Anand Patwardhan's films could not make it to television, but then some did. And how they went about that.
So I'll actually go back to something that you mentioned briefly, and so maybe it's something to pick up now. The comparison to the our current pandemic moment, conversations around media assemblages and sort of creating of these publics around health concerns that remain, and there are different ways in which representation works over there, right? From migration to religious groups, to essentially how that sort of publics comes into being. And so I don't know, I mean, you brought it up briefly while you were talking, but maybe you want to talk a little more about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the cultures of uncertainty, that particular concept, and there's been a lot of discussion about how risk is something more calculative, is more, probabilistic, more statistical, but that uncertainty difficult to calculate, or difficult to sort of put within a frame of sort of being able to foresee all the scenarios. So, and this is used again by both sides in a kind of, if there are many sides to it, not just two sides particularly, but it's often that in a particular moment where, experts themselves are kind of, there's no consensus within the experts about what is the specific threshold level, or what are the what are the strategies of preventing against, and that's something that was very much there in the kind of cell antenna debates, and that perhaps allows sometimes for the so-called, like, sort of lay person to also have the kinds of evidences that they're bringing out in the form of anecdotal evidence to sort of travel. And one sometimes, sometimes this kind of anecdotal evidence is extremely important to consider. Other times it could be considered misinformation, disinformation, so on and so forth. And one sort of sees that also during the sort of COVID pandemic, where initially there was a lot of attention also to, say, surfaces. And, you would see people, clean their groceries, clean their hands often. And that still remains, and there's still not maybe a complete sort of emphatic saying that, surfaces are not that important. Perhaps most important, it's only the respiratory, but that's mostly how it's spread, nose and mouth. But there still remains that kind of a certain persistence with which people still wash hands, and so that regimen, again, like some have made it less now, but it still remains. And the fact that it remains suggests that the ways of coping with that kind of uncertainty, people find their own ways of doing it, and that really happens when expertise itself is kind of divided. And that's what you see with the example of the peacock too. I mean, that example where one sort of relies more on peacocks than radiation detectors. Even though the peacocks are also brought in, as you said, some other words, that it's still within a certain kind of evidentiary paradigm, but it remains within a certain kind of anecdotal evidence vis-a-vis, the scientific evidence.
Yeah. Actually, we're kind of close to time, and yeah. I honestly don't have anything else. I just want to congratulate you on a fantastic book, and thanks. Really throw up a lot of questions. And I think we'll continue this conversation offline as well. I also do want to remind folks who tuned in that this Rahul's work, and especially this talk, is actually part of the larger imagination for publics, in the sense that it is something that we would like to continue on within the broader umbrella of urban imaginaries, which, like Rahul mentioned, was started with a conference about a month back, and we will continue that through the public series. So thanks again, Rahul, and thanks for folks who tuned in. So I'll my closing over here, hand it over to
thank you, Rahul, for that really interesting talk. Thanks, Vikas. Thank you, everybody who joined us on Zoom and Facebook also. A recording of this talk will be made available on our YouTube channel. And please follow us on social media and subscribe to our newsletters for updates on work on IIHS and our events. So thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. Good evening. Bye.